He didn't come to court looking for a fight. General Malcolm Rhodes came to speak the truth. But when Officer Troy Becker, a white cop with a dark agenda, pulled a gun on him in front of the entire courtroom, the line between justice and intimidation shattered. Why would a decorated black war hero be targeted during a legal hearing he was only testifying in? And what truth was so dangerous that someone tried to silence it with a weapon? If this moment makes you stop and think, hit like, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe to Echo Blind. Now, let me take you inside that courtroom. It happened so fast, the entire room forgot to breathe. General Malcolm Rhodes had just taken the stand, his hand still resting on the edge of the witness box when the silence cracked like thunder. He had come to testify in a case involving a young black Army recruit who claimed he was assaulted by police during a routine traffic stop. A case that on paper was supposed to be simple. But nothing about this moment was simple. Not when Officer Troy Becker was sitting 3 rows back, his eyes locked on Rhodes like a man holding a grudge too old to name. The courtroom was packed civil rights observers, reporters with notepads in hand, families with folded arms and cautious hope in their eyes. There were cameras too discreet, but live, beaming the image of this trial to anyone across the country who cared enough to watch. And then came the moment no one saw coming. Without warning, Troy Becker stood up. The courtroom marshal took half a step toward him, maybe sensing something. But before anyone could speak, Becker's arm moved like it had done this 100 times before. A flash of black metal, a gasp from the far bench. The gun came up in one fluid motion, cold and deliberate, pointed straight at the head of General Rhodes. You could hear the collective intake of air. A woman screamed. Somewhere in the back, a child cried out and clung to his father's shirt. And yet, in the center of all that panic, Malcolm Rhodes didn't flinch. He didn't duck or shout. He didn't raise a hand in protest or beg for mercy. He looked straight into the barrel of the gun with the same calm he once held on the battlefield. His voice didn't shake when he said, "I've stared down the barrel of a Taliban rifle, son. I just never thought I'd have to do it in a courtroom, in my own country, from a man in uniform." That one sentence landed like a hammer. You could see the ripple move through the crowd. First, disbelief, then fury, then something colder, quieter. It was as if the room suddenly understood it wasn't just a gun pointed at one man. It was everything Rhodes stood for. His medals, his silence, his dignity, his refusal to play the game they expected of him. The judge shouted for order. The bailiffs swarmed forward. Becker didn't fire. Not because he had second thoughts, but because Malcolm Rhodes had already taken the power away from him, with just a look, just a sentence. And that was enough. In the chaos, someone knocked over a chair. A reporter dropped her phone. An elderly man whispered, "Dear God, they were really going to kill him." And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the scene froze like time itself holding its breath. The gun was lowered. Becker was tackled. The cameras never stopped rolling. And right then the story paused, not in the courtroom, but in the mind of every person watching. Because this wasn't the beginning of a tragedy. It was the continuation of something older, uglier, and far more dangerous. We're not going to start with how it ended. That would be too easy. No, to understand why Troy Becker stood there with a gun pointed at one of the most decorated black generals this country has ever known, we need to go back. 3 days back, to be exact. Before the cameras, before the testimony, before the courtroom turned into a war zone. Because Malcolm Rhodes didn't just walk into that courtroom by chance. He was summoned. And he knew from the moment he received the call, it wasn't justice they were looking for. It was silence. 3 days before the courtroom fell silent, General Malcolm Rhodes sat alone at his kitchen table, bathed in the warm morning light that crept through the curtains. A cup of untouched coffee sat beside him, cooling slowly. In his hand was an envelope, thick and formal, stamped by the River Haven Municipal Court. The subpoena inside requested his presence at an upcoming trial as a character witness. Rhodes had seen plenty of trials in his lifetime, but something about this one made him hesitate. He did not recognize the case number, and when he looked up the defendant's name, Private Darius King, all he found was a brief article titled, "Army Recruit Charged with Resisting Arrest During a Traffic Stop." No photos, no details. Just another headline, too familiar, too vague. He slid the envelope aside. He was not interested in being used as a prop brought into court so they could say they respected black soldiers and still walk away having silenced another young man in uniform. But then came the second letter. This one was not typed. It was written by hand, the pen strokes uneven but deliberate. There was no seal, no formality. Just his name and a return address he did not recognize. He opened it slowly, already feeling the weight of something more personal. "If you don't speak for me," the letter read, "they'll silence me forever." Malcolm paused, eyes locked on the line. The words were not elegant, but they did not need to be. The voice behind them was real. Darius had written about the night he was stopped, how he was ordered out of the car before he could speak, how an officer shoved his head into the pavement while calling him boy, how his body cam mysteriously turned off just before the struggle. The letter ended with a quiet plea. "They think I have no one. I hope I'm wrong." Malcolm folded the letter gently like something fragile. He stared out the window for a long while before whispering to no one, "You're not wrong. Not yet." That evening his daughter arrived. Elias Rhodes was a seasoned attorney, sharp and principled, with eyes that missed nothing. When he showed her the letter, she read it silently, jaw tightening. Then she asked the question he expected. "Do you think this is a setup?" He looked at her but did not answer right away. She continued softer now. "You remember what happened in 2017? The threats. The names they whispered to reporters? They're still here, Dad. The gatekeepers didn't disappear just because we stopped talking about them." He did remember. The gatekeepers were an unspoken network of officers, prosecutors, and even judges who quietly protected one another behind closed doors. White men in uniform who saw accountability as betrayal. Years ago, Nia had helped expose a cluster of wrongful arrests tied to them. They had both paid a price. Anonymous calls vandalized property, and a quiet warning that some fights were not meant to be won. Malcolm took a deep breath. "If this is a trap," he said, "then it's one I need to walk into." Nia stepped closer, searching his face. "Why this case? Why now?" He picked up the letter again, holding it with the same care he once gave folded flags on bases far from home. "Because they think they can hurt this boy and no one will notice. And I think it's time someone reminded them we notice." The next morning he sat at his desk and opened a drawer he had not touched in years. Inside were medals, citations, and a photo of his old unit, young black and brown men standing in dust and fatigue, some smiling, some staring off like they knew they might not come back. He looked at them one by one, remembering each name. He did not need a court to validate his service. But he also could not ignore what it meant when a fellow soldier asked for help not from a general but from a man who understood what it meant to be black and invisible in uniform. Later that day, Nia prepared the paperwork. She did not say much, but as she handed him a file folder, she said, "If anything feels wrong in that courtroom, you don't try to be brave. Just walk out." Malcolm nodded, though they both knew he would not walk away. That was not in his nature. The night before the hearing, he stood in front of the mirror adjusting the cuffs of his dark gray suit. No medals, no symbols, just his name, his voice, and the truth he carried. Before leaving, he looked at Nia once more. "If I come back empty-handed," he said, "make sure they still hear me." She did not answer. She did not need to. He stepped into the quiet dawn, unaware that within 72 hours the courtroom would erupt into chaos. And somewhere inside that silence, the world would begin to watch. Long before General Malcolm Rhodes stepped into that courtroom, he had already faced darker storms and survived them. In Afghanistan, years earlier, he had led a high-risk mission that saved over 40 soldiers caught in an ambush. 3 of those soldiers were white officers who would later rise to powerful ranks in the military. They had praised him in their reports, even called him the backbone of that operation. But when the dust settled and the medals were handed out, it became clear that valor did not always erase color. The gratitude faded. The distance remained. Malcolm never considered himself political. He didn't lean left or right. What he stood for was harder to categorize, the kind of justice that made people uncomfortable. He refused to smile for systems that applauded his heroism on foreign soil, but treated him like a liability at home. And when one of his fellow officers casually referred to a group of black recruits as frontline bait, Malcolm filed a formal complaint. That decision nearly ended his career. An internal investigation was launched not into the officer who made the comment, but into Malcolm himself. They questioned his leadership. They dug into years of records. He remembered sitting alone in a windowless room being asked whether he had ever harbored resentment toward white authority figures. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just looked them in the eye and said, "I resent cowards who protect injustice, no matter their color." Eventually, the investigation was dropped. Quietly. No apology, no acknowledgement, just silence. The officer he reported was reassigned, not disciplined. And Malcolm, well, they made sure to stall his next promotion for nearly 2 years. That was the message. Speak up, and we'll remind you how expendable your dignity is. But Malcolm never forgot. So when the subpoena arrived for the trial and that handwritten letter from Darius King followed it, he knew what he was walking into, and still he walked. Yet even with that resolve, strange things began to happen in the weeks before the trial. His military email account, long dormant since retirement, suddenly showed signs of unauthorized access. At first, he dismissed it as a fluke. But then it happened again and again. Files vanished. Old correspondences reappeared in his inbox. One night, an anonymous message simply read, "Stay home, General. It's safer." He didn't tell Nia at first. There were things he didn't want her to carry, not because she couldn't handle them, but because he didn't want her fire to turn into fear. Then came the articles. Out of nowhere, media outlets began running old headlines about his internal complaint from years ago. The headlines didn't mention why he had filed it, just the fact that he had. They painted him as combative, unstable, difficult to manage. One article quoted an unnamed source saying Rhodes had a chip on his shoulder. Always did. None of the articles mentioned the mission in Afghanistan. None of them mentioned the lives saved. Nia saw the pattern instantly. "They're laying the groundwork," she warned. "If something goes wrong at trial, they'll say it's because of your history. They're prepping the narrative." Malcolm read the headlines, then folded the paper. "Let them dig," he said softly. "They'll find the same thing. They always find a man they couldn't bend." There was a moment of silence between them, the kind of silence where love and pain live side by side. She reached out, touched his arm. "They're not just trying to scare you. They want to erase the weight your words carry." He nodded, then looked her straight in the eyes. "Then I'll remind them." By now, Malcolm understood this wasn't about one young soldier or one bad cop. This was about a system that worked overtime to silence certain truths. And he knew what systems like that feared most. Not noise, not protest, not even exposure. They feared memory, because memory was powerful. Memory had roots, and Malcolm carried memories deeper than most men dared to touch. He wouldn't walk into that courtroom as a broken man or a bitter one. He would walk in as someone who had earned the right to speak even when it made others shift in their seats. The battlefield had changed, but Malcolm Rhodes hadn't. And neither had his oath, not to a flag, but to the people behind it, the ones who always bled first and were heard last. They said Officer Troy Becker was not supposed to be in that courtroom, not officially anyway. A week before the hearing, his name had vanished from the roster. Internal Affairs had opened an inquiry into his use of force against a young black soldier during a roadside stop. But somehow, despite the scrutiny, despite the outrage, he showed up in uniform, fully armed, standing near the witness stand, as if nothing had happened. When questioned later, the department claimed he had been reassigned temporarily for courtroom security, but no one could find the request. No digital logs, no approval codes. Just a single sheet of paper signed in ink by Assistant Chief Douglas Vance, the same man whose name had once surfaced during a stalled investigation into corruption within the River Haven Police Department. That paper, unsigned by a judge and not filed with the clerk's office, was the only document authorizing Troy Becker's presence that morning. And it was enough. But Rhodes did not know any of this when he entered the courtroom. What he did notice, however, was the stare. Cold. Fixated, familiar, like someone who had been waiting years to finish what they started. 3 years ago, during a veterans' charity banquet, Becker had been overheard saying that Rhodes did not know it yet, but the next time he saw him, he would not be standing for long. Most people laughed it off. It was a party after all, just alcohol talking. But one guest, a former military MP, remembered that moment, because even drunk Becker's voice did not shake, and neither did his intent. That same guest, months later, witnessed Becker staying late at the precinct long after his shift had ended. The lights in the training room stayed on, and inside, Becker stood facing a wall gun holstered at his side, practicing his draw, over and over again. Smooth, swift, silent. He was rehearsing something. No one reported it. Maybe they were afraid. Maybe they did not want trouble. Or maybe they had already learned the rules of this place. Some names and some badges you simply do not question. Rhodes, of course, had seen that look before. Not just on battlefields or in briefings, but in the eyes of men who believed a uniform gave them permission. He did not need classified files or phone taps to understand what was happening. Instinct told him everything he needed to know. Becker was not there to protect anyone. He was there to make a point, a final one. And yet, no one stopped it. No one pulled him from the rotation. No one checked his record or asked why a man under investigation had access to a live weapon in a courtroom full of civilians, media, and vulnerable witnesses. Because in Riverhaven, some uniforms came with a shield stronger than law. Silence. There is something cruel in how systems like this operate. Not through overt declarations, but through paperwork that never gets filed. Through nods at private dinners. Through silent approvals passed over coffee in hallways no one records. And Becker was fluent in that system. His badge may have been tarnished, but his backing was intact. That is why he stood there that morning, cold and calm, his hand just inches from the weapon strapped to his side. That is why the room held its breath when Rhodes took the stand. Not because anyone expected danger, but because somewhere deep down, they all knew this was about more than testimony. This was about silencing a man whose truth had always made them uncomfortable. A man who did not kneel to titles or threats. A man who still wore his honor like a second skin. And Troy Becker came to tear that skin open. But what he did not know was that Rhodes had seen this coming. Not the gun, not the exact moment. But the pattern, the quiet reassignment, the blank stares when questions were asked, the familiar silence of power preparing to strike. And yet Rhodes showed up anyway, because that is what real soldiers do. They show up especially when they know someone is trying to stop them. By the time the trial began, you could feel something thick in the air. Not fear exactly, not quite anger either. It was the kind of tension that settles in when people know the outcome has already been chosen, and yet they have to sit through the motions anyway, pretending the process still matters. Judge Carl Winslow sat upright, face carved from stone, voice measured, words precise. On the surface, he was the picture of professionalism. No raised voice, no outward bias. But every time the defense tried to introduce evidence, a dashcam video, a complaint record, a forensic report, he shook his head and cited procedural inconsistencies. He wasn't overt. He didn't need to be. His authority was in the rhythm of rejection. And with each denied motion, the message was clear. This courtroom would not be a place where truth interrupted order. Rhodes, seated in the witness box, did not flinch. He had seen men hide behind rules before. He had faced tribunals in foreign lands where the law bent to fear. But here in his own country, it cut deeper. Elaine Mercer, the prosecutor assigned to the case, was known for her composure. Smart, poised, and sharp as broken glass. Her questions started routine enough dates times the context of Rhodes's presence, but it didn't take long before her tone shifted. Subtle at first, then colder. She began circling around Rhodes's past reprimands, trying to paint him as impulsive, emotionally volatile, too close to the case. "General Rhodes," she asked with polite precision, "can you confirm whether in the past you've ever raised your voice during a military tribunal?" He looked at her without blinking. "I've raised my voice to stop injustice. That includes battlefields and courtrooms." There was a faint murmur in the gallery. The judge tapped his gavel not to reprimand her tactics, but to silence the public reaction. Nia Rhodes, sitting just 2 rows behind her father, clenched her jaw. She had seen this tactic before. When the system could not destroy your credibility with facts, it tried to undo you with feeling, make you emotional, make you snap. And as Elaine paced a predator disguised in high heels, Nia's eyes drifted to the far end of the room where Officer Troy Becker stood. He wasn't watching the proceedings. He was watching her father. Unblinking, expressionless. A statue with a grudge. Every time Rhodes shifted slightly in his chair, Becker adjusted his stance. Not overtly, just enough to track him, like he was waiting for a signal, and then came the whisper. It slid across the bench like a breeze through cracks in old wood. An older staffer in court uniform leaned in toward a younger bailiff, not realizing Nia could hear, or perhaps not caring. "Becker's not supposed to have his weapon," the staffer said under her breath. "Court security never cleared that." The bailiff didn't respond, just nodded slowly, as if acknowledging a truth that couldn't be spoken aloud. Nia's heartbeat quickened. She wanted to move, to stand, to call it out. But she had grown up in courtrooms. She knew the cost of interrupting a judge, especially one like Winslow, who wore the law like armor and wielded silence as a blade. And still, through all of it, her father never broke his pace. When the judge allowed him to speak, Rhodes didn't raise his voice. He didn't defend himself from the insinuations or lash out at the unfair framing. He simply picked up his written statement, unfolded it with quiet hands, and began to read. It wasn't a testimony, not in the way they expected. It was an obituary. Not for a person, but for something larger, for dignity, for service, for a promise made long ago between country and soldier that if you give your life to protect a nation, that nation will protect your name. He spoke not with anger, but with ache. About the young black soldier whose cries were ignored. About a system that filtered justice through skin tone. About officers who turned their badges into shields and prosecutors who confused law with loyalty. Each word landed like a slow drumbeat. By the time he finished, the courtroom was silent. Not out of reverence, not out of fear, but because no one quite knew how to respond. They weren't expecting grace. They were expecting a man to break. But General Malcolm Rhodes came to that courtroom knowing exactly what was stacked against him. And he brought something more powerful than rage. He brought the truth. The courtroom was already tense. The air felt heavy, the kind of stillness that clings to the skin right before a thunderstorm. The debate between the lawyers had grown sharper, but nobody expected what came next. Malcolm Rhodes stood tall at the witness stand, his voice calm and steady as he answered another pointed question. Then, without warning, Officer Troy Becker took a slow, deliberate step forward from his post near the side exit. His hand hovered near his belt, not like a man protecting others, but like a man preparing for something he had already decided to do. A flicker of realization crossed Nia Rhodes's face. Sitting just 2 rows behind her father, her eyes narrowed. She saw it before anyone else did, the way Becker's body shifted, the tightening of his jaw, the flick of his thumb near the latch of his holster. She opened her mouth to shout, but the moment beat her to it. In a blur of movement, Becker drew his weapon and aimed it directly at Rhodes's head. "You think you're above the law, you traitor?" he screamed. The courtroom exploded in chaos. People gasped. Some ducked, others froze in disbelief. A woman shrieked and clutched her child. A security officer hesitated, clearly stunned by who was holding the gun. The cameras kept rolling. But Rhodes didn't move. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't even blink. "I have stared down the barrels of rifles held by Taliban fighters," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade through water. "And now I find myself facing the same threat in an American courtroom from someone who was supposed to protect it." He didn't look afraid. He looked tired. Not of life, but of moments like this. Of having to stand strong where others are allowed to be weak. Of being treated like a danger when all he did was speak the truth. For a moment, time folded in on itself. Malcolm wasn't in the courtroom anymore. He was back in a desert in Afghanistan. Blood in the air, dirt in his mouth, standing between a convoy and an ambush that should have killed them all. He remembered 3 wounded soldiers he carried to safety that night, 2 of them, white one, barely 19, calling for his mother. And now years later, this was his reward. He didn't lower his gaze. He didn't yell. He didn't plead. He simply looked at Becker like a father looks at a broken son, with disappointment, with grief. Behind him, Nia's body was rigid. Every muscle told her to leap, to run, to scream, to protect. But she didn't. Her hands balled into fists on her lap, her fingernails cutting into her palms. The cameras didn't blink either. They caught every frame, the fury in Becker's face, the calm in Rhodes's eyes, the silence that said more than any scream could. In the corner, a young black boy clutched his father's arm and whispered, "Why is he pointing a gun at the hero, Daddy?" The father didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat locked with something too heavy for words. An older woman pulled a rosary from her purse and held it close to her heart. Her lips moved silently. The security team finally moved far too late and wrestled Becker to the ground. But even in cuffs, he kept shouting, "He's a liar. He's dividing us. He deserves it." Rhodes didn't respond. He just looked down at the floor, then slowly raised his head and met Becker's gaze for the last time. Not with hatred, not even with anger, but with something colder, quieter disappointment that cuts deeper than rage ever could. That image of a decorated black general standing tall with a gun to his head and not flinching spread across the country within minutes. It played on every major news network. It flooded social media. It pierced the hearts of people who had tried to look away. And for the first time in a long time, silence became too loud to ignore. By the time the courtroom had cleared and silence reclaimed the halls, the spin machine was already in motion. The news broke before sunset, but not with the truth. Not with what millions had seen live unfiltered. Instead, headlines read, "Officer suffers PTSD episode in courtroom incident." Another read, "Decorated Officer Troy Becker temporarily detained for mental evaluation." The framing was subtle, almost surgical. Not once did they mention the loaded weapon. Not once did they say the name Malcolm Rhodes. Only a retired service member, like he was a footnote to his own trauma. Rhodes sat at home, the lights dim, a blanket tossed loosely over his lap. He didn't need to see the television. He'd already lived it. But still the screen flickered, painting soft shadows across his face. Nia stood nearby, arms crossed, disbelief tightening her jaw. "They're painting him as the victim," she whispered almost to herself. "Not you." He didn't answer. Not right away. The silence stretched, the kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from deep boiling clarity. Finally, Rhodes spoke low and even. "I've seen war. I've seen good men break and bad men thrive. But this is the only battlefield where lies wear uniforms and still get saluted." Elsewhere, a different storm brewed. Veterans' forums lit up with anger. A post from a former Marine with the handle Stonewall 77 went viral within minutes. It read, "If that had been a white general, Becker would have been in cuffs before the echo of the gunfire died. Ask yourself why he's not." That night, dozens of veterans, black and white, stood outside the courthouse in full dress. No shouting, no signs, just silent formation. Some saluted, some prayed. One held a photo of Malcolm Rhodes from Kandahar with the caption, "You don't point a gun at this man." Back in the city, a young security guard named Enrique Alvarez sat in the parking lot of the courthouse, phone in hand, debating. His thumb hovered over the screen. He knew what he had. The hallway camera footage showed Becker entering early, wearing gloves he never wore on duty. It showed him pacing, adjusting the holster, preparing. He hit send. The clip landed on the desk of an independent journalist by midnight. 2 hours later, it was everywhere. News stations tried to ignore it at first, but the internet. It roared. A mother in Chicago tweeted, "My son just asked me, is that what they do to black generals now?" I had no words, just tears. A teacher in Atlanta added, "This isn't just about one courtroom, it's about all the rooms we've been silenced in." And then it came like the tide breaking free. The hashtag #StandWithGeneral surged across every platform. Within hours, artists painted murals, students wrote open letters, and churches held candlelight vigils. Even schoolchildren asked to include Rhodes's story in their civics projects. Yet through it all, Rhodes remained silent, not because he had nothing to say, but because his silence now carried weight, the kind that echoes louder than shouts. It was the silence of a man who had already given the world his words, his service, his loyalty, and was still handed a loaded gun in return. In one of the quieter moments that week, Nia sat beside her father and gently asked, "Why won't you speak, Dad? Why not just say what needs to be said?" Rhodes looked out the window where the early morning sun struggled through the clouds. He didn't look at her when he replied, Because when a man has to explain why he shouldn't be shot for wearing a uniform, maybe it's time for the world to do the talking. And somewhere across the country, in a room with no cameras and no reporters, a phone rang. Not at a newsroom, not at a police station, but in a government building whose silence had lasted long enough. The sun had barely risen when Nia Rhodes returned to her office, her mind still racing from the night before. The courthouse security footage was one thing, but she had a feeling the corruption went deeper. She wasn't just her father's daughter today. She was a federal attorney, and her instincts were screaming. For hours, she combed through court system access logs, subpoenas, internal memos. And then tucked inside an encrypted archive that shouldn't have been visible, she found something she almost couldn't believe. A thread of emails between prosecutor Elaine Mercer and Judge Carl Winslow. The tone was casual, almost smug. And there, at the end of one message, sat the sentence that made Nia's stomach turn. "We need him to lose his temper on record. That'll be enough." She read it again. Then again. There was no ambiguity. This wasn't a trial. This had never been about justice. It was a setup carefully constructed to paint her father as unstable, a threat, a liability. She forwarded the emails to Rhodes with a single message. "They planned it. You were right." Later that afternoon, Rhodes sat in his den, the room quiet but not still. His military medals glinted faintly from the shelf behind him. Nia stood nearby holding the phone as her father looked directly into the camera. This wasn't a press conference. It wasn't a campaign. It was simply his voice calmly recorded, sent to the offices of 3 senators, 1 independent news network, and a circle of trusted veterans groups. The video began with no introduction, no anthem, just Malcolm Rhodes in a soft gray sweater seated in silence. Then his voice. "They wanted me to lose control. They wanted a headline they could use, a moment of rage they could spin into fear. But I did not lose my temper. I stood still because I carry something heavier than anger. I carry the hope of those who no longer have a voice. The ones who wore the same uniform, bled the same blood, and were buried with the same flag. I spoke calmly because when you are standing in the middle of injustice, sometimes dignity is the only weapon they cannot take from you." The video was under 2 minutes long, but by the end of the day, it had been viewed over 6 million times. Every major news outlet replayed it. Not because they were forced to, but because public pressure had begun to smother them. Veterans groups across the country released joint statements condemning the silence of law enforcement and the judiciary. They called for transparency. They demanded accountability, and then came the call to the Bureau. With rising demands from both the public and powerful congressional allies, the FBI was formally requested to investigate the incident as a federal matter. Not just the weapon drawn in a courtroom, but the manipulation of a trial, the silence of a judge, the buried threats sent through official channels. For the first time, the gatekeepers were no longer protecting one of their own. They were being watched, but it didn't stop there. One of the oldest and most respected veterans associations in the nation released a rare open letter. It bore thousands of signatures from former generals, colonels, and enlisted men alike. The letter made one demand: that Officer Troy Becker be charged with assaulting a federal witness under oath. They called it not just a crime, but a desecration of service. And yet, in the eye of that growing storm, Rhodes stayed quiet. He had said what needed to be said, nothing more, nothing less. The silence now belonged to others, the institutions, the investigators, the lawmakers. But behind closed doors, Nia leaned over to her father, voice steady but low. "You know what comes next, don't you?" Rhodes nodded, his face unreadable, as if staring through years of fatigue and faith. "I know. But this time, they'll have to face more than me." The weight of his words settled like dust in the room, slow and heavy. For the first time in weeks, there was a shift. Not of power, not of revenge, but of truth beginning to stretch its arms and stand again. And this time, the world was watching. The courtroom felt different that morning. The walls seemed quieter, the people more alert, as if everyone present understood they were not just witnessing a sentencing, but something far more consequential. The trial of Officer Troy Becker had gripped the nation. For 3 long days, it unfolded under the scrutiny of cameras, veterans, civil rights groups, and a public unwilling to let this moment pass in silence. Testimonies came in waves, each more revealing than the last. A courtroom clerk recalled Becker walking the halls the day before the shooting, muttering to himself and rehearsing something under his breath. A security officer testified that Becker's weapon had never been logged or approved for courtroom carry that day, and a fellow officer speaking under protection admitted he had heard Becker refer to Rhodes as a traitor just days earlier. But what broke the silence in the room was the chain of internal emails between Prosecutor Mercer and Judge Winslow. They were read aloud slowly, sentence by sentence. The phrase that echoed hardest was simple yet chilling. "All we need is for him to lose his temper. The rest will take care of itself." That line landed like a thunderclap. The crowd shifted. Even the judge presiding over this new trial closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if acknowledging the shame the institution had brought upon itself. Elaine Mercer resigned from her position within hours of those emails going public. Judge Winslow was placed on indefinite suspension pending a federal inquiry. Neither spoke to the press. General Rhodes never said a word during the trial. He sat still, dressed in a modest, dark suit, hands resting on his lap, eyes calm but unwavering. When he entered the courtroom each day, he would nod respectfully to the judge, then take his seat in the gallery. He never looked at Becker. Not once. And then came the sentence. The judge stood, looked Becker in the eyes, and spoke with a weight that needed no raising of voice. "You did not just threaten a man. You threatened the very meaning of public service. You dishonored your oath, and you attempted to silence the truth with a gun. There is no badge that shields that." Troy Becker was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom remained quiet. No cheers, no applause, just a collective release of breath. One photo from that moment would go on to define the aftermath. It was captured just as Becker was being led away. He glanced back. Rhodes was standing now, facing him. Their eyes met for the first and only time. Becker looked hollow, diminished. Rhodes looked steady, unshaken. No hate in his gaze, just something deeper, something like mourning. As if he saw not just the man Becker had become, but the society that had quietly made space for him. That photo would make its way into newspapers across the country. And beneath it, no captions were needed. The verdict echoed beyond the walls of that courtroom. Veterans groups called it long overdue. Civil rights leaders called it a beginning, not an end. For once, the system had not protected its own. And while Rhodes never claimed victory, the weight of his silence said everything that needed to be said. He had never raised his voice. He had never retaliated. But in that quiet strength, in that refusal to be broken, something shifted. Not just in the courtroom, in the country. And maybe, just maybe, in history itself. They called it the Rhodes Court Protection Act. Passed in near silence, it was a law written not in anger, but in the aftermath of dignity. It barred the presence of firearms in all civilian courtrooms across the country. From that moment on, no officer, no matter their badge or background, could carry a weapon inside a space meant for justice. And with it came something just as important, a mandate that every officer assigned to courtroom security must pass independent psychological and ethical screening free of internal influence. The law was signed with little ceremony. No flashing cameras, no long speeches. But when it passed, something shifted. Not just in the legal books, but in the hearts of those who had watched, waited, and wept. At the steps of the very courthouse where it all began, a memorial was built. Nothing grand. Just a smooth, black stone, curved like the back of a man who carried too much for too long. On its face, etched in silver, were the words that had echoed through every screen in America. "I'm not afraid of the law. I'm afraid of the rot that hides behind it." People came in quiet waves to visit. Veterans, mothers, young black teens who had never believed justice could look like them. And others too, people who may have once looked away, but now found themselves staring into a reflection they could not ignore. Rhodes never attended the unveiling. He declined interviews, declined medals, declined the notion that his silence had somehow made him a hero. When the president's office offered him the nation's highest civilian award, he wrote only one sentence in reply: I ask only that the honor be given to every soldier whose name was lost to silence and shame. It was Nia who spoke at the memorial, standing beneath the flag that barely moved in the summer air. Her voice was clear, steady, and strong. "My father didn't need to shout for justice," she said, looking out at the rows of faces before her. "He carried it with him. And when he walked into that courtroom, justice followed." The crowd stood in complete stillness. No applause. Just breath held and eyes that quietly filled. Later, when everything had calmed and the headlines had moved on, a video clip began to circulate online. It was grainy, taken from someone's phone, showing Rhodes stepping out of the courthouse for the last time. He paused just at the doorway, one hand brushing the edge of the memorial stone. Then he walked away slowly, his shoulders straight, his eyes forward. He did not look back. And maybe, just maybe, that was the point. Because when a man has given everything to protect a truth bigger than himself, he does not need to see what is behind him. He already knows it changed. If this story spoke to you even in a quiet way, we hope it stays with you. Because what happened in that courtroom was not just about one man or one moment. It was about a deeper truth. About how silence, when held with dignity, can shake the walls of power more than any shout ever could. General Rhodes did not ask for applause. He did not chase revenge. He stood still and let the truth speak for itself. And in doing so, he reminded us that courage is not always loud. Sometimes it is calm, steady, and unshakable. If this story moved you, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And do not forget to subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more powerful human stories just like this one. Your support means everything to us. It gives our team the strength to keep writing, keep creating, and keep lifting up the voices that too often go unheard. Because here at Mr. Mac's Stories, we do not just tell stories. We remember, we reflect, and we stand with those who stood when no one else would.